I'd like to talk about Greece. We used to classify Greece as an industrial country, but it now seems to show many of the attributes of an emerging financial market, with excessive debt and weak institutions and an economic depression that really is about the level of the 1930s. Many of these problems were a direct consequence of joining the Eurozone in 2001, which seems to have led quickly to an overvalued currency and exploding current account deficits, much like Argentina in the 1990s when they pegged their currency to the US dollar. Now, the IMF is predicting a resumption of growth, and I'm asking the students in my emerging financial markets class to give an assessment of that prediction. But it does look like it may not entirely come true. In Greek politics seems to be polarizing during this time of stagnation. What lies ahead for Greece? Does it face, for example, the possibility of an explosion of violence, left-right violence? They have a history of left-right warfare, 1948. What are the chances of violence erupting? The second and third most popular parties in the country now are the extreme right and the extreme left. What's going to happen to Greece politically?
All right. Well, thank you again for having me here. I'm particularly pleased to be here because I'm also one of the faculty members associated with Chazen Institute, so it's a particular pleasure to be able to participate at an event like this. And your question is a tough one because let me start by saying that all of Europe is going through tough times, yes, as you all know, and Greece, in some sense, is the focal point. And if troubles were to start somewhere, Greece would very likely be, in fact, the fuse for the troubles. It is important to realize what, David, you already mentioned, that the amount, the extent of recession is really a depression. So Greece is going through sort of the 1930s type depression. Output has fallen dramatically. Wages have fallen dramatically. Unemployment has shot up tremendously. If there is an explosive part of the population, it's the young people, and Greece has over a 55% youth unemployment rate at this point. So you can imagine what that's doing to ideas and activities that could lead to the kind of explosion. And the end doesn't seem to be in sight in the sense that despite the measures that have been taken, and there are some important adjustment measures that have been taken, raising the retirement age significantly, lowering wages, as I mentioned, and so on, stabilizing the debt level, let's say, to some extent. Indebtedness is measured as debt divided by GDP. So when GDP is falling, as it has been in Greece dramatically, indebtedness is growing. Right? So Greece is, in some sense, in the eyes of the analysts and financial markets, getting worse by the day, despite all these measures. So it's a very tough situation to be in, and many Greeks feel picked upon and protest. Yeah, so indeed, your question is right on. And it's an issue which is in some sense coming back to the many reforms that have been successful in terms of the European project as such since World War II, building unified Europe after centuries of wars, carnage, etc. The whole project deserves incredible amount of admiration, respect, and support in some sense. But the step to introduce a single currency without the accompanying measures of fiscal coordination and some kind of banking type union, things that are being talked about now, and especially for the weaker countries like Greece, but there is Italy and there is Spain, who really needed to adjust internally in terms of making their labor market institutions more flexible, making sure that productivity and wages in some sense behave in a related way in order to stay competitive. All those accompanying measures didn't take place. And the financial markets at the beginning read the introduction of euro as really creating a US-style union where everybody is willing to essentially bail everybody else out. And so interest rates, which were quite high, dropped for the Mediterranean countries. So the Greeks and others had an incredible bonanza in the sense that to service their debt, they suddenly needed much less money. and they spend the extra windfall funds not just on doing the kinds of structural reforms that were needed, but by raising salaries of workers in the government, public sector, and so on. And that was, in fact, the beginning of the trouble. Then the markets woke up one day and raised the risk premium again back to levels that were there before, in fact, in overreacting even higher than that. And literally no government, not even the German government, could service its debt at 18% interest rate, or the heights that were reached temporarily. The market rates went down, but not back to sort of zero or close to zero spread with the German debt. So what you have is a situation where the Greeks are in a very difficult situation. They feel put upon also because when they look at whom they owe the money to and who is dictating to them the terms, it's the countries whose banks, France, Germany, invested in Greek bonds, right? So the question is, who is in trouble? Is it the banks in France and Germany, or is it Greece, right? And of course, what did the banks in France and Germany do? They went to their government and said, look, either you'll bail us out, or you better make sure that the Greeks pay, right? So the Greeks are feeling that the pressure that's coming from the rich part of Europe, together with the IMF and Brussels bureaucracy, is a little bit unfair, because there were business decisions made by seasoned bankers in these countries to invest in their country when they knew fully well what the underlying fundamentals and situation was. So wherever one assigns the blame, the situation is not tenable in the way it is now, and Greeks are basically demanding a more accommodating approach. The rest of the Europeans understand that as well, but understand that there is an important timing consistency problem, that if you bail out the Greeks for the promise of future reforms, the future reforms may not obtain, right? So in some sense, you want to provide some funding maybe, but do it simultaneously or in tranches, if you want, as with the reforms as they're undertaken. And that's what Europe is trying to figure out how to do nowadays. And remember, Greece is really very small. It's less than 2% of European GDP. The big problem would be Spain, Italy, countries that are not in as dire situation as Greece, but essentially are there. And the problem that you mentioned at the beginning, the violence or the inclination, propensity to start supporting extreme views or populistic views, is not just isolated to Greece.
Mm-hmm.
You have Le Pen party in France doing extremely well. You had in Italy Grillo and this populist sort of group scoring very well. So the problem is more general, and I think Europe is teetering on the verge of either making it and getting out, and everybody in Europe is praying for some growth, because growth will help. Right now, Europe has been stagnating. So compared to the US, where we complain we have slow growth, and we have slower growth than we would like to have, Europe really has been stagnating over the last few years on average. Some countries slightly growing, but the Mediterranean countries declining. So I think that what really is the big question here, will Europe at this point be able to adopt a more, if you want, cohesive strategy that will lead them forward, realizing that if they want to have some integration, there may have to be also some cross-subsidies. In the US, we have some states that receive subsidies year after year after year after year, right? And we don't even realize it fully, but it happens, southern Alabama, whatever, countries, states like that. So, maybe, that's part of the price you pay for really unifying. I think Europe is not there right now. So I think the danger is that, it could go in the explosive direction. I hope it won't. But clearly people are working on it. There is a lot of good brains that are trying to figure it out, but it's a really difficult political problem.